Joining me now is Mike Renner, lead draft analyst at Pro Football Focus. Thanks for joining me, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
So let's break down the quarterbacks a little bit ahead of this year's draft. Want to start by just who you think is going to be taken with the top overall pick?
I think it's going to be C.J. Stroud. If you saw the clip of Josh McCown at Stroud's pro day saying they were talking about, shooting hoops, playing basketball. Stroud's like, there's a court here. He's like, let's wait until you get to Carolina. If you don't say that to a guy, in my opinion, unless you're planning on making him the number one overall pick, I know there's a video on the internet of McCown gushing over Stroud's tape against Georgia, and I think all the tea leaves are pointing in that direction at the moment. So I think it's going to be C.J. Stroud, even though he's not the top quarterback out of the PFF board and a lot of boards around the NFL, but he does tick a lot of the boxes that I think Frank Reich wants for his offense. So I think that's going to be the pick.
How does PFF have the top four quarterbacks ranked, and what would you say are strengths and weaknesses of each one?
This quarterback class is difficult to rank because I have Bryce Young as PFF's QB1. I think he is a special, like if he is 6'3", 220, we're talking about him as a Joe Burrow, Trevor Lawrence-like prospect, where it's like, yeah, you just take that guy and he's your franchise for the next 10 years. But he's not. And so that's kind of, again, like when the top quarterback comes with that big of an issue that he's 5'10", 200 pounds because he drank, 3 gallons of water before he weighed in. Like he's just a small guy, smaller than any quarterback in the NFL nowadays. That's a hard sell. So he's QB1 just because of on-field. And then after that, it's almost a pick your poison. I have a tier. I had to rank them. I ranked them Levis, Stroud, Richardson. But in my opinion, it's so based off of what you want in your offense, what you're planning on running. To me, Stroud's the best pure pocket passer, the way kind of the quarterback position's been played for so long. And I think that gives him a higher floor than maybe, say, a Will Levis and Anthony Richardson, at least in the passing game. You've seen him do a lot of NFL concepts, and you see him work with timing a lot better than those guys and much more accurate. And then the other two, with Will Levis, it's like, what could this guy be? Because he's got probably the best arm talent in this draft class. When you compare, when you put his release and how quick it is with how much zip he can put on the ball to all three levels of the football field. And then the fact that he's played with kind of the worst situation of any of the quarterbacks in this draft class. He was under pressure almost twice as many snaps last year as C.J. Stroud was. And that's just something that prepares you for the NFL game more in that regard, and played for 2 NFL offense coordinators at Kentucky. So like the NFL aspect of Levis's game, he has a lot of those, even if the statistical profile isn't near the other guys. And then Richardson's like the wild card. He's the one you're drafting if you really want to go run heavy with your offense. You want the quarterback involved in the run game, because obviously you saw him with the freakiest testing athlete of all time at the quarterback position at the combine, and just has a cannon for an arm. Like the tools are all there. You're just going to have to develop, because he's only a 1-year starter. So it's just so few snaps under his belt. So it really is, in my opinion, after Bryce Young, a pick your poison.
Has Richardson done anything the last couple of weeks to impress people and maybe convince them that all of that elite raw talent is more lucrative and important than maybe even a couple months ago?
So for my money, I don't think the biggest things, accuracy, consistency of footwork, consistency of technique. At his pro day between the combine, just pure throwing wise, I don't think he's shown that that's fixed. But it wasn't expected, right? It's like assuming a pitcher who's wild is going to become Greg Maddux overnight. It's never the case. Like with Josh Allen, it took until year 3 for him to fix that. So this was and always is going to be with a guy like that, when he is as just rough around the edges from an accuracy perspective, it's going to be a year-on-year improvement that you're hoping for. And you're hoping that once the comfort level gets there, once the repetitions get to enough of them, that all of a sudden his ceiling can push higher than the other guys because of how strong his arm is, because of how athletic he is. So I don't think he's necessarily helped himself over the past handful of weeks. It's either you bought in prior to this pre-draft process, or you really had too many concerns to draft him on.
There's nothing that Bryce Young can do about his size, as you pointed out, outside of maybe drinking 3 or 4 gallons of water to try to convince people that he weighs more than he does. The lines in the offensive, the offensive and defensive lines in the NFL are formidable. They keep getting bigger and bigger. Pass rushers are enormous. I mean, is Bryce Young's size enough of a deterrent that you think teams are just going to say, you know what, we can't, regardless of his natural ability, we can't bring this guy in. He's too small?
I think so. And it's not necessarily we can't. It's just that I'm going to look elsewhere. And we're obviously just talking about that with Carolina. I think on tape, I haven't met someone who said Stroud's tape itself was better than Bryce Young's in terms of how he plays the quarterback position. But I have heard people say, one hit for a guy that size can knock you out a year. And you saw, it's not helping his case that Russell Wilson got hurt in the last year and a half, that Kyler Murray has gotten hurt in the last year and a half. Like, it's not helping that these small guys are running into some injury issues at the NFL level and that Young himself missed the game this past year with a shoulder injury, just because the way he plays, like, he wants to extend plays. He's not really, protecting himself as probably as much as he could have on tape at Alabama. And once you get to the NFL, as you said, they are bigger. They are more explosive. They're hitting you with just a little bit more force, and force when you're 195 pounds and 5'10" hits a little different than when you're Josh Allen, at 240 pounds. So that's probably, that's the worry. That's why you would stay away from a guy like that, is because you just can't rely on him now with 18-week seasons.
So with that in mind, with some of the X factors and the size issues that you're seeing with the quarterbacks outside of CJ Stroud, who you said was QB1 for PFF, how do you see these quarterbacks being taken? Is there a chance that all four of them go in the first round pretty early, or are we gonna see, some of these other guys maybe fall down the draft a bit?
I think at minimum, the first and second overall picks are going to be quarterbacks. At minimum, Carolina and Houston are taking quarterbacks. And Houston would be out of their mind. And now the interesting thing about Houston is they are still such a poor roster, shall we say, at this point, that they could be in the mix next year for next year's quarterback class too. And they could theoretically say, hey, we'll play for that year. But that's not in NFL coach's DNA, in my opinion, to look towards the future and say, we'll pass on a quarterback this year, next year is our year. I just don't think that's in decision makers' DNA. So it's 1-2 is QB. And then it becomes fun, right? Because Arizona's not going to draft one, even with Kyler Murray's ACL tear. They're not, at least this year, going to take a quarterback. And so are they going to trade that pick? Could it be kind of a turning point in the draft? Does someone want to jump Indy? Because I know Indy's in this QB class too. So I think you see at least 3 QBs in the top 4, and then it becomes, where does the fourth one come off the board, and who's the fourth one, truthfully, at this point. So yeah. I think 3 QBs go in the top 4, and then after that, the fourth one could either go in the top 10, could fall all the way to the 20s.
And how volatile could this potentially get we already saw Carolina trading up to secure CJ Stroud if that's what they want to do, but with some of these other QB needy teams, as a quarterback or two become available later on, do you think that we're going to see teams getting creative? Is it going to get explosive in terms of trading up, trying to secure one of these guys, if not just to have them in the fold while they continue to pursue their need for franchise quarterbacks? Indy is interesting because, they kick the tires on Lamar Jackson a little bit, but it seems very clear that they want to build around a young player, and, those kinds of generational talents get picked up in the draft.
Yeah, I think this draft is ripe for trades. I truly do. One, because the quarterback situation, one, could be sliding down the board. That obviously could spur some movement. Two, because you have a lot of now analytically driven minds at GM around the NFL who, in their eyes, trading down is always the superior option. So it behooves them to trade. So you're having that as well. And then I think there's some certain positions that I would consider valuable positions that are a little scarce in this draft, specifically offensive tackle, where there's probably 4 guys that you want. After that fourth guy comes off the board, there's going to be a chasm. And so if you are later in the teens, early 20s, I would be surprised if we don't see someone trading up for an offensive tackle in this draft.
Where does Pro Football Focus stand in terms of weighing up natural, raw, elite talent and ability and what guys do at the combine versus fit? Because you mentioned, schematic fit with Carolina and CJ Stroud and how excited they are. And I feel like that's always the chicken or the egg question, is like, how well does a guy fit in the system? Where's the balance there in terms of just getting the best available player versus the guy that might fit the best?
It's hard for us on the outside to just, to rank a board, truthfully, because we have no scheme to fit into. We're just like, this guy fits into this scheme, but only like 3 or 4 teams around the NFL are really running that. So then those guys who are, super scheme specific tend to fall down draft boards because of that. But it's massively important, I will say, for the actual where guys come off the board. And, there are certain players who just will not be drafted into certain teams. And Kalijah Cansey, the Pittsburgh defensive tackle, really comes to mind when I'm thinking about that. There are people that just will not draft a 6-foot-tall defensive tackle. They're just wholesale. That's not what their defense calls for. So there are others that will. So it's something that has to be done when you're talking about where a player could go and should go. But I think when you're on the outside looking in, I'm assuming, that Kalijah Cansey is going to a role that's going to be to his strength. So I have to rank him accordingly, because it's kind of like Tariq Woolen last year. I ranked him a lot higher than where he went, because I thought he's going to end up getting drafted by a team who's going to want him to play the coverages that he excels at, these silo coverages where he can just play up and down the field using that speed. And he did in Seattle, and all of a sudden he's great. So that's the hard part as kind of the evaluator on the outside, but it is super important for NFL teams. You see a lot of square pegs and round holes throughout the NFL end up, that's why end up flourishing at other locations via free agency and whatnot. So I would say it's very important.
Do you see Hendon Hooker potentially sneaking into the first round anywhere?
I don't. One, because there's already 4. 4 is a lot of quarterbacks already. And quarterback's a position where, like the Kansas City Chiefs, I don't care who falls to, they're not drafting a quarterback. Buffalo Bills, they're not drafting a quarterback. Patrick Mahomes incarnated could fall to them. They're not going to take another one because you just don't need it. So there's only so many teams that need it. And if 4 have already gone, is there a 5th? And is there a 5th who wants a guy who may not even play as a rookie, who has coming off a torn ACL, who's already 25 years old? Like, you can love his tape and say that it's unlikely that any team's going to make him their, most teams only get 1 first-round pick. 5 teams get 2 this year, but most teams only get 1. Are you going to make that guy your 1 premium selection? I just think I don't want to say slides. I just think he's probably more coming off the board somewhere in day 2.
How do you view Jalen Carter, who's one of the more intriguing prospects in the draft? I mean, has been categorized as maybe having off the field issues. To be honest with you, and I mean, you can share more insight on this than me, I don't really even know how much that matters anymore in today's NFL. But how do you view him in terms of his value and where he could potentially land in the draft?
Yeah, I don't think it will matter for people drafting when you are to that caliber of talent. And I think we saw that with the Deshaun Watson saga last year, that people are willing to give him a key to a city just to make him their franchise quarterback. I think Jalen Carter, he's the best non-quarterback in this draft, in my opinion. A lot of people's opinions. When that's the case, you're street racing, you show up overweight to your pro day, you have all these things in the pre-draft process. Well, you flip on the tape and he's the best player in this draft, you're still drafting him. I do think he still ends up going somewhere in the top 5 or 6 picks. Now, obviously, if you are drafting there and have a chance of getting him, you're going to want to bring that guy in your building and say, has he learned from these things that have gone on, or is he still just treating it like it's no big deal? Then that could realistically push him down boards. But I think he's obviously signed with a good agency. They're going to tell him how to respond to all these things. And then at the end of the day, teams are going to say, this guy's the best DT in the draft. We'll take him.
And I guess I should clarify by saying I don't know how much impact off the field issues necessarily have when you have a prospect as appetizing or intriguing as this guy. But the fact that he came in a little bit heavier might be something that would give teams pause, because that actually is an applicable on-field sort of red flag. Is that unusual that you would have a guy who's the best prospect outside of the quarterbacks come in and look in less than stellar shape? And is that enough to bring teams to a point of bringing him in and saying, hey, listen, are you going to be able to dial in the way that we need you to dial into? Or is that something that just happens once players typically get drafted?
I will say that is highly unusual for a player of that caliber, like any first rounder, to show up like that. It's reminiscent of, there was a defensive lineman from Florida a couple of years ago who it wasn't to the degree of prospect as Carter was, but it was talked about as a first round pick in Ja'Kai Polite prior to the pre-draft process. Shows up heavy, runs horribly, gets drafted out of the NFL within a year and a half. So it is something that, if you go a little bit further down the board, if you're not the elite of the elite, if you're just good, if you're just a prospect who's considered probably, fringe first rounder, that will scare teams away for sure, because then you have other options in the similar tier that you'd probably take first, but there's no other option really in the Jalen Carter tier besides like Will Anderson in this draft class. So once he's gone, you probably make some excuses for Carter's behavior.
Can you give us an example, Mike, of some players from smaller schools who might be steals or guys who are on the board that will either surprise people by getting taken higher than we might think, or that could be really, really good value for some of these teams?
One of my favorite small school prospects in this draft class is, I'm going to go offensive line. It's not the sexiest position, but Cody Mock from North Dakota State is a guy that will be a fan favorite for whatever team he goes to. He's a converted tight end at North Dakota State. I think he added like 80 pounds over the course of his college career, has long red hair past his shoulders, and he is the most athletic offensive lineman in the draft class. Doesn't make sense. Like, the guy looks hilarious on tape, but he runs down linebackers. He's like faster than these linebackers coming to get him. So would not be surprised if, I don't think he sneaks into round one, but if early in the second round, his name gets called and he has a long NFL career. So he's one of my favorite watches in the draft class.
You know, the trenches aren't necessarily the sexiest place to pick, like you said, but a lot of times having a strong offensive line is what gets you to a Super Bowl. And you mentioned his sort of build being a tight end converted and maybe a little bit lighter in the loafers than some of these other guys who are just absolutely massive. Is there a shift, or do you think there could potentially be a shift for teams that are looking for a little bit more athleticism on the line? I mean, I'm always amazed by how fast those guys can move. I think about on the defensive end, like a guy like Vince Wilfork, who when you saw in person, you're just like, oh my God, this guy's huge, but he was so athletic and almost nimble on his feet. Or are we going to kind of see the status quo, which is guys just getting bigger and bigger and retaining some of that athleticism?
I do think teams are coming around to the idea more so that they are not, and especially a guy like Cody Mock coming from North Dakota State, they're not finished from a strength perspective when they're hitting the NFL. They're still only 22, 23 years old, and over the next 2 or 3 years can put on 10 to 15 pounds of muscle. And so it's the athletic part that's harder to find, that's difficult to change. It's harder to make a guy faster who's already that size than it is to make a guy stronger who's that size. So I think a lot more teams are willing to take kind of like a Charles Cross last year. Charles Cross showed up at 285 at his pro day. That's a skinny tackle by NFL standards. But he goes to the NFL, one of the best rookie left tackles in the league, because it's the movement skills that are tough to sort of, find a guy at that size, 6'5", with that long arms that can actually mirror the Von Millers of the world. So I do think you're seeing more and more NFL adapt to what wins at that position.
I'll only keep you for a couple more minutes because I've kept you for too long already. But can you break down, Mike, some wide receiver prospects for those who are interested in their drafts?
This is a weird wide receiving class. It's not like the last couple that we've become accustomed to, where there's just a guy who's going to be great and and you just draft them, and then year one it's 1,000 yards. There's not that guy in this draft class, truthfully. I think all of the top receivers in this class, and I think there's probably a group of 5 that are going to be the first 5 off the board, whatever order it is. I'm not necessarily sure, but it's Jackson Smith-Njigba from Ohio State, Quentin Johnston from TCU, Zay Flowers from Boston College, Jordan Addison from USC, and then Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee. All of them have like serious glaring issues in some way, shape, or form. With like Jackson Smith-Njigba, it's that sat out a whole year with a hamstring injury and is not particularly fast. With Quentin Johnston, it's that he had over a 10% drop rate in his career, even though he's this monster, massive, should be a contested catch wide receiver, but not good at those contested catches. With Zay Flowers, it's that he's 5'9", 180, that he's a very short, small wide receiver. With Jordan Addison, it's that he's super skinny, only 170 pounds. That's unique at the position. And then with Jalen Hyatt, it's that he played in a Tennessee offense that really didn't ask him to run more than a few routes, and he's not facing press coverage. So all these guys have like serious issues in some way, shape, or form, or serious concerns, I'll say, in some way, shape, or form. So I'm not sure where they come off the board, but the desperation you saw last year, where there was that run of wide receivers, I expect it again. I expect a lot of these guys to get pushed up because it's the teams that stockpile 2 and 3 dynamic wide receivers that are winning around the league.
Which corner do you think will be taken first?
I lean towards Christian Gonzalez from Oregon. Yikes. Didn't mean to, Oregon fans, don't hate me. Because he ticks the most boxes, size, speed, athleticism, ball production. It truly is all there. Now I have Devin Witherspoon from Illinois, top on the PFF board. I think he's feistier. His tape last year was just a little more dominant, but he's 181 pounds. You know, Christian Gonzalez is almost 200 pounds. You're talking about, you're projecting to a league where the receivers get a lot bigger, they get faster, and you need guys who have the size and speed to keep up with them. So we'll see. Devin Witherspoon, I believe, is actually running either today or tomorrow at his pro day at Illinois. So we'll see how actually fast he is. I believe he's pretty fast. On tape, he really is, but he's still not big. And so I think Christian Gonzalez, but it wouldn't surprise me if someone falls in love with Devin Witherspoon's tape. I think it's going to be one of those two guys.
Two more for you. We talked a little bit about the wide receiver position and how kind of funky that could be, and we've broken down the quarterbacks and touched on some other specific players. But positionally, if you had to pick a position that you feel like has the most value in the draft, where would that be?
That's a great question. I think it depends on where you're drafting one. I think in the first round, obviously quarterbacks, but then after that, I think you're going edge or offensive tackle, and especially offensive tackle, because you look at the last 2 years of all pro teams, first and second teams, 4 different guys. I think it was actually 6 different guys, all first round picks. The elite tackles at the NFL level are easy to identify, kind of because of what I was saying earlier. The guys who are 6'5", 300 plus pounds with 34-inch arms that run 4.8 40s are there's so few of them that actually have that you can identify them. So the amount of third round tackles that turn into all pros and pro bowlers is just so few. So that's why you see them drafted earlier, is because they're very easy to identify. Everyone seemingly needs one. And then it's a super valuable position after that. And then obviously on the other side of the ball, the edge rushers are another position that the athletic traits are easy to identify. There's only, again, so many guys with that level of burst that can play that. Whereas at cornerback, a lot of people are 6 foot. A lot of people are 180. You know, you kind of get the whole population in there of people to pick from. And then the cream kind of rises to the top. So you can find like 3rd, 4th rounders to play cornerback at a high level. I just don't think that's the case at tackle and edge.
So lastly for you, Mike, just maybe back to this crop of quarterbacks and maybe beyond, who do you think, which specific player do you think has done the most in this process over the combine and what they've done in recent weeks to set themselves up best to exceed expectations or hold expectations in terms of their value ahead of the draft?
You said the quarterback position?
Yeah, it could be a quarterback, or honestly, it could be beyond. Or if you have one from each, I would take one from each. But I'm just wondering which players come to mind for you that have done the most to put themselves in the best position to succeed in the draft.
I think one guy I mentioned, I'll say 2 guys I mentioned already. One, Kalijah Cansey, the Pittsburgh defensive tackle. Because, you know, on tape, you're like, this guy looks like a linebacker. He's tiny for a DT. But then he tested out as the single most athletic defensive tackle in NFL history. He's better 3-cone short shuttle in 40 times than Aaron Donald. And Aaron Donald's like the gold standard, right, for athleticism along the defensive tackle position. So I think he's definitely helped himself. Another guy I think is Jackson Smith-Njigba. I think he truly, people came in, what's his speed going to be? What's he going to look like? Sat out a whole year with a hamstring, and then has the best 3-cone, the best short shuttle, and runs a 4.52 40, which is more than fast enough. You know, that's faster than Devontae Adams ran coming out, faster than DeAndre Hopkins, Cooper Kupp. That is, you know, that's ticking all the boxes. We're good. You know, Jack Smith-Njigba, you're going to be a solid NFL player. So I think those 2 guys thought of as, you know, prior to the drafting process, are they going to go first round? I thought there were people that definitely had later than first round grades on them. Now I'd be very surprised if either of them made a pass like pick 20.
Mike Renner, lead draft analyst at Pro Football Focus. Thanks so much for the insight and taking the time. I feel like this is your Christmas this time of the year, like watching these guys mature and develop. It must be a good time for somebody that cares about this as much as you do.
It really is, because, you know, I've watched some of these guys 2-3 years, like, anticipating this. So like I say the best time is actually when I actually get to see them on a football field next fall is when I'm the happiest, because I'm like, did I get it right? Did they actually, are they who I actually thought they were going to be? That's like when it's really good. But this time of year is when I'm the busiest and truly can talk for days about this stuff.
Thank you so much for joining me.